I want to start with Jon Snow. And Jon Snow is essentially the father of epidemiology. He was made famous for curing a cholera outbreak in London. He traced the outbreak to a contaminated well at Broad Street, and then he ordered that the well handle be removed so that people couldn't get any water from the well anymore. So this is a time series chart. We're all familiar with time series charts. We see them all the time in classes, laboratories, that sort of thing. It's organized by week, and you can see that the cholera epidemic was going strong and in fact getting higher and higher and higher frequency of death. And then the pump handle was removed and all of a sudden people stopped dying, and Jon Snow is a hero. It's a fantastic thing, okay? If I take that same time series chart and just shift the interval we're seeing, these are by weeks, and I'm just going to shift the week by 2 days, you can see actually a more dramatic heroism at work. 1 week, wow, a lot, no one was dying, then everyone was dying, and then the week after, all of a sudden, fewer people are dying. So the notion of exactly where I place that interval, where I start and end that week is at play here, and it's something that you have to consider when designing these charts. But let me show you one more chart. Okay, pretty clear that Jon Snow is a hero here. But what if we chart the data by day? Okay? And if you chart the data by day, cutting that interval into smaller amounts of time, you can see that, in fact, the epidemic was already subsiding pretty dramatically before the well handle was removed. Okay? And this event, this cure, this epidemic stopped in its tracks that has made Jon Snow quite famous, actually, he isn't the hero of this epidemic. The data shows us that it was tailing off on its own. Now, make no mistake, Jon Snow is a hero, just not for this. And I encourage you to read about him, okay? So this is a good example, and it sparks the question I want to spark for you guys today, which is, what's the role and the risk associated with time in how we organize information? These are letters. We all like letters. We love letters, okay? But they don't have any meaning. And what we forget sometimes is that it is the sequence of letters, the before and after, that allows them to blossom into meaning in our mind. And this property of time, physicists call it the arrow of time. Even though there is no physical property, no math, nothing in the books, nothing in the rules, nothing that anybody can find that says that time has to move in one direction, okay? As humans, we universally perceive it as moving in one direction. And that perception colors and organizes information in a way that is sometimes subtle and sometimes perilous and sometimes very exciting. So I want to talk about the arrow of time. Words, of course, are linear, but so is music, so are movies, so is Morse code. This says beat chote, by the way, just so you know. It says beat chote. But really, we could be talking about anything. This linear organization of information aligns perfectly with how we consume information. So even if we see something in 3D, the reality is that our thoughts and our perceptions are sequential according to the arrow of time. Here's an example of some of the things that arrow gives us, and these are pretty heavy concepts, okay? The simplicity of before and after, the was and the will be, gives us things like rhythm and pattern and sequence, okay? The notion of speed, anything that is divided by time comes from this sense of the arrow of time, and without it, we would be living in a very confusing information space. These are two photos that kind of illustrate that ability for a lack of time's arrow to confuse us. These are considered, or rather the photo on the right was published. It's called The Valley of the Shadow of Death. It's taken during the Crimean War, and it is considered the first photograph of war. And as you can see from these two photos are basically taken at exactly the same time. And in fact, it's very difficult to determine which one was taken first, nearly impossible. Errol Morris explored this question on his blog a couple years ago, and it was a fascinating conversation online. So without time's arrow here, without knowing what came before and what came after, we don't know whether the photographer put these cannonballs on the road or whether he took them away. And indeed, even the way I have organized these images on the slide implies an arrow of time, because in the Western Hemisphere, we read from left to right. And simply by switching those images, I may create a different implication for you. I may create a different suggestion of before and after. And this question of which came before and which came after is baffling in this case, but it is the key to understanding the photographer's intentions. Is this the first photograph of war ever taken, or is it the first photograph of war that was ever faked? Here's an interesting and useful sign. It's of my own design. It's inspired by the recent weather we've had, okay? And I think that a lot of us, when we view graphics such as these, we think of the experience as being strictly linear. You start at the top and you work your way down. But that's not actually the case. What happens is these things are organized in time, okay? Now, the assumption is that you start at the top and then you read the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, okay? But in reality, as a designer, I think of these different sizes of type not as bigger and smaller or above and below, but as closer, and they look bigger, and small and further away, so they look smaller. So if you view this design through the landscape of time, you get to see a different perception of how this image is consumed. And from a graphic design standpoint and an information design standpoint, this is the way we think about things when it comes to usability. What are you going to see first? What are you going to see next? The next time you're driving along a highway, realize that those signs, the size of the typography, is calculated against the rate of speed that you are likely traveling in your car at that time, okay? And they've calculated how far away you will be and at what speed you will be traveling, and therefore how big those letters need to be. It's all organized in time. Here's another sort of two-dimensional, flat, familiar interface is a map. Now, we've all used maps for a long time. There's a particularly old one. But we forget about the role of time in how we use maps. Imagine for a moment that there was no before and after. There was no arrow of time. And all of a sudden, you can't remember what you were just looking at. You can't trace your path from one place on the map to the next place on the map. You can't think of where I was and where I will be, okay? Viewing a map through this sort of narrow view of the now is a very difficult experience, and the utility of that map goes out the window pretty dramatically. Of course, maps are passé. They're old-fashioned. We don't use them anymore, or Siri shows them to us on our phones, okay? We use GPS, and what most people don't know about GPS is that GPS satellites are really just flying clocks. They're very precise clocks. And what they do is they report the time all the time. They just spray the time out to whoever's listening. And we tune into that signal in our dashboards and our cell phones. And using some really, really, really simple algebra, we're able to locate ourselves in relative position to those satellites. So this location-based information, this GPS system that we all think is location-based, is actually time-based. In the old days, we didn't have GPS to synchronize everybody, okay? And GPS was invented to synchronize our military worldwide. That's why it was invented, so that a plane leaving from Montana to bomb some target could be coordinated against a ship that was already there, okay? But in the old days, towns had their own clock towers, and those clock towers were timed against the sun. So 12:06 in one town might be 12:15 in another town, might be 12:02 in a third town. And that was fine. You know, the world was less efficient. Humans were less precise. There was more waste. It was okay? But it was a different time, we might say. What caused us to really need synchronicity, the kind of synchronicity that's embodied in GPS, is really an increasing ability to get it, okay? And as we achieved greater precision in our timekeeping, we are able to benefit from it more and more. So Galileo was the first to observe the periodicity of a pendulum, and pendulums then became the source and the structure behind most clocks of the time. But there were other timekeeping devices, such as candle clocks. This candle is designed to burn at a certain rate, and there are little marks on the holder to tell you how much time has elapsed. Now, that's probably not very precise, but at the time that these candles were used, it was a very useful measure. Incidentally, this is where the phrase burning the candle at both ends comes from. As we move forward, even things like calendars were not synchronized or agreed upon. Muslims and Jews use different calendars. Right now is the Chinese New Year, and in East Asia there's a lot of lunar calendars being used. But George Washington, when he was 21 years old, we switched from one calendar system to another, and he instantly became 20 again. Okay? He was denied legal drinking age immediately through a calendar change. So this is a pretty recent development. This isn't ancient Egypt's time system. This is pretty recent. We even changed daylight savings in 2007, even though no one really knows what it does. So synchronicity was actually born out of railroads. So in the late 1800s, 1860s to 1900, when a train left one place and needed to be another place at a particular time, right, to track speed, arrival times, departure times, that's where synchronicity and eventually GPS comes from. Railroads, incidentally, were also the progenitors of time zones to standardize time across larger distances. So I want to talk a little bit about this transition from sort of relative flowing time to synchronized ticking time. And I like to put it most recently in the context of personal time. So 10 years ago, people wore watches, right? We don't really wear watches anymore, except as jewelry or novelty. I guess next month, when Apple invents the watch all over again, we'll start wearing them again. But if you all had a watch, you would have the ability to choose whether to set that watch forward a little bit or backward a little bit. You could choose how tightly you wanted it, to tick, how often you made sure it was correct. So you actually had your own personal time zone as late as 10 years ago. And today, we don't have that anymore. Everybody in this room has a smartphone probably or a cell phone of some type. And that is synchronized against a national clock, which is itself synchronized against GPS. So you've given up the notion of a personal time zone in the last decade. Some of you are too young to have made that decision consciously. Sorry, too bad. It was great. It was great, okay? So this is the big transition that we've experienced, and it's influenced not only in how we consume information and how we create information. This transition from sort of local, personal, fungible time to synchronized time, where you can really look in over vast distances and see the same thing. We moved from flowing time to ticking time, where interval is really important and really rigidly controlled. No one debates the length of a minute anymore, right? No one debates the length of an hour. But in the old days, they just divided the daylight by 12, okay? And in the winter, an hour was shorter, and in the summer, an hour is longer. And probably most important, we don't watch the clock anymore. Instead, something beeps to tell us where we need to go. And this is a pretty big shift in human behavior. And that shift in human behavior is something that, as designers, we need to take into account. How are people going to react to things? How are people going to respond to things or not based on this new behavior? So I started this talk by highlighting this notion of interval, not only the choice of where that interval begins and ends with the week, but the choice of a day instead of a week on a time series chart. And I used a time series chart because we all use them all the time. And this determines, exactly how big Jon Snow's legacy is. But there are other time series charts that may have a greater and more meaningful or perhaps even a life and death impact. And I want to talk about one. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger was going to be launched, and it was going to be launched on a record cold day, okay? We're all familiar with cold, okay? It was going to be 30 degrees in Florida, and all the rocket scientists, and it's important to remember that these are rocket scientists actually working on rockets, they gathered together to ask the question, will it be too cold to launch? Because we're a little afraid the rockets themselves, the O-rings in the rockets, will be too fragile at those temperatures, okay? So they gathered together the night before the launch because, the clock is ticking, T-1 day. That clock is not changing, okay? They gathered before and, spoiler alert, okay? I'm going to skip ahead. The launch went off. They decided to launch, and the rockets exploded, and everybody on board died. So this is a big deal. This is a life and death decision. Will it be too cold tomorrow to launch? But this is the data they reviewed. This is a chart of all the previous rocket launches organized by time. And in the yellow things at the top, which I've highlighted them in yellow, it shows the temperature. And the red items are places where there was damage in the rockets in the past. But left to right, you're seeing time, early rocket launches to late rocket launches. So I ask you guys, based on this chart against time, this time series, will it be too cold tomorrow to launch the rocket? It's pretty hard to tell. So if I take the liberty, okay, or actually I leave it to Edward Tufte to take the liberty of redesigning this chart, here's the same data. And now time's dominion, time's the comfort we have with time as a go-to reference source has been thrown away. And you see severity of damage on the y-axis, and you see the temperature of previous launches on the x. With colder temperatures on the left, you can see the highlighted area all the way at the bottom, which is the projected launch, okay? And the temperatures of all the past launches with damage indicated on the right. Now, you've only seen this for a second, but I think you can see this trend right here, right? As soon as you get rid of time as an organizing factor, this trend becomes very apparent. And choosing the right variable and getting rid of that comfort with time and getting past it is the key to seeing it. And I ask you, would you have launched the rocket? Thank you.